The gavel slammed down, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps rippled across the gallery, and the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Judge Harrison said, "Order." His voice shook the wooden panels. A reporter's pen froze mid-stroke, ink pooling at the edge of the page. At the witness stand, Maria Carter said, "He lied under oath." Her voice cracked, trembling, spilling out raw truth no one expected. The jurors stiffened, one clutching the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. A coffee cup fell, spilling dark liquid across the cold marble floor. Thomas Reed, the defense attorney, leaned forward, his jaw tightening as if bracing for a storm. The accused, Daniel Hayes, sat motionless, sweat shining under the harsh lights, his eyes wide like a cornered animal. The gallery erupted into whispers, panic and thrill weaving together in the air. Judge Harrison's gavel thundered again, but it could not silence the shiver of lives unraveling in an instant. The silence after the gavel faded was heavier than before, wrapping the room in suffocating tension. Maria's accusation still burned in the air like smoke, every eye locked on her fragile frame. Thomas Reed said, "Your Honor, this is improper testimony." His voice cut sharp, but underneath it, unease trembled. Judge Harrison's glare hardened as he said, "The court will decide what is proper." Maria's chest rose and fell, her grip on the stand unrelenting. The jurors exchanged quick glances, uncertain whether to believe or to doubt. Daniel Hayes shifted in his chair, a faint shake betraying his stillness. A whisper passed through the gallery, an old man muttering, "She's cracked." The bailiff stepped closer to the witness stand, sensing danger in the tremor of the moment. Every heartbeat in the room thudded like a drum, waiting for what would come next. Thomas Reed pressed his palms against the table, his voice low but edged with steel. "This is an attack on my client," he said. The prosecutor, Evelyn Shaw, rose swiftly, her red blazer striking like a warning flare. She said, "No, this is the truth the jury deserves." The jury stirred, discomfort echoing across their faces. Judge Harrison raised a hand, his deep voice booming. "Enough. The court will hear this witness." Maria's breath trembled, her eyes darting between the lawyers, then to Daniel Hayes, who looked at her with an expression more plea than threat. The air thickened with the promise of revelations too heavy to bear. Daniel Hayes leaned forward, his face ghostly pale, words slipping through clenched teeth. "She's lying," he whispered, but the microphone caught it, carrying it across the silent courtroom. Gasps broke again, the gallery erupting in murmurs. Judge Harrison's gavel struck once more, harder than before. Evelyn Shaw's eyes flickered with sharpness, as if she had been waiting for his slip. Maria's face crumpled, tears pooling, yet she did not look away. Every juror's stare locked onto Daniel, measuring truth and deceit in his breaking posture. The courtroom was no longer just a chamber of law, but a battlefield where every word was a weapon. Judge Harrison said, "We will proceed." His voice was a blade against the chaos. The jury's pens scratched notes furiously, capturing fragments of a storm that could shatter lives. Evelyn Shaw's eyes never left Daniel, while Thomas Reed leaned closer to him, whispering words no one else could hear. Maria Carter closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling as if she bore the weight of more than truth. The gallery shifted restlessly, people sensing that what began here would not end cleanly. The courtroom settled into uneasy silence, but inside Maria Carter's chest, her heart pounded like a war drum. She glanced toward Daniel Hayes, his stare piercing through her, heavy with accusation. She said, "I swore to tell the truth, and I will." Her words cracked the stillness, her voice carrying both fragility and fire. Thomas Reed shook his head slowly, whispering something to Daniel that only he could hear. Evelyn Shaw's gaze sharpened, her eyes cutting like a blade as if daring Maria to reveal more. Judge Harrison leaned back, his face unmoved, but his fingers tapped the bench, betraying the tension beneath his calm. The jury leaned forward, some scribbling furiously, while others simply stared at the witness with suspicion. The gallery seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Maria to either collapse or ignite. Evelyn Shaw rose, the click of her heels striking the floor echoing like a countdown. She said, "Maria, were you pressured to remain silent before today?" Maria's lips trembled as she inhaled sharply. The question landed heavy, dragging invisible chains into the open. Thomas Reed bolted upright, his voice sharp. "Objection!" Judge Harrison's gavel tapped once, the sound controlled but commanding. "Overruled," he said, his voice steady. "The witness may answer." Maria looked down at her hands, then back up at the jury, her voice faint but carrying. "Yes," she said, "I was told to stay quiet." Gasps again, like the room had forgotten how fragile silence could be. The jury shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Mariah's words settling like stone on their shoulders. Daniel Hayes shook his head slowly, his lips moving in a silent denial no one could ignore. Thomas Reed turned sharply toward the jury, his voice slicing through the air. "This is nothing more than theater, designed to smear an innocent man." Evelyn Shaw countered swiftly, her tone ironclad. "This is truth clawing its way through lies." Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed, his gavel hovering above the bench, as if ready to drop at any moment. Maria's breathing deepened, each inhale sounding louder in the aching quiet. Maria's gaze swept over the jury, her voice trembling yet rising with conviction. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid," she said, her words carrying like an arrow across the room. "But the truth doesn't vanish just because we silence it." Thomas Reed slammed his palm against the table, his frustration rattling through the wood. He said, "This is a circus, Your Honor." Judge Harrison lifted his eyes, his expression unmoving. "It is a trial," he replied, voice steady, unshaken. Evelyn Shaw's lips curled into the faintest smile, though her eyes remained locked on Maria with relentless intensity. The gallery stirred, restless, sensing the stakes were climbing beyond repair. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself as if on the edge of collapse. Then she spoke again, softer but cutting through the air like a whisper in a storm. "I will not be silent anymore," she said. Her words bent the room in half, forcing every listener to confront them. Daniel Hayes dropped his gaze, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. The jury scribbled quickly, every pen stroke a sentence forming in the shadows. Judge Harrison leaned forward, watching Maria with the quiet study of a man who had seen countless lies unravel, but rarely such naked truth. Evelyn Shaw's eyes gleamed, a spark lit where calculation met conviction. The gallery leaned forward as if closer would bring them the full weight of the moment. The tension rose higher as the prosecutor called the next witness, a man whose eyes flickered with unease as he approached the stand. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat down, shifting uncomfortably in the chair. Evelyn Shaw said, "State your name for the court." His throat tightened before answering, the silence pulling every gaze toward him. "Mark Ellis," he said, his voice brittle. Maria Carter's eyes locked on him, her breathing quickening. Thomas Reed leaned forward, pen tapping the table, his stare unyielding. Judge Harrison watched with a heavy brow, studying every twitch. Daniel Hayes exhaled slowly, trying to mask the storm raging beneath his skin. The gallery stirred again, sensing this testimony would tighten the noose further around the truth. Evelyn Shaw stepped closer, her tone cutting sharp. "Mr. Ellis, did you witness Daniel Hayes on the night in question?" Mark's jaw flexed, his eyes darting toward Daniel before returning reluctantly to the prosecutor. "Yes," he said, his voice shaking. Thomas Reed shot up, his voice booming, objection leading the witness. Judge Harrison raised his gavel, but did not strike, his gaze steady. "Overruled," he said. "The answer will stand." The jury leaned in, pens scratching, while Maria pressed her hands tighter against the wood. Daniel clenched his fists beneath the table, his knuckles whitening. The air thickened with each word, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Mark Ellis shifted again, his eyes glistening with sweat. "I saw him near the alley, arguing with someone," he said. The gallery murmured in ripples, the words twisting like a dagger through the silence. Daniel shook his head furiously, his lips forming unheard words. Thomas Reed pounded the table, his voice breaking. "He's fabricating this." Evelyn Shaw's smile was thin, calculated. Judge Harrison's voice rolled heavy. The jury will decide what they believe. Maria lowered her head, trembling as if her chest might collapse under the pressure. The entire courtroom pulsed with heat, the battle between truth and deception burning brighter than before. Thomas Reed rose swiftly, adjusting his tie with sharp precision. "Mr. Ellis," he said, voice like steel, "how can we believe you when you've changed your story twice already?" Mark's eyes widened, his lips pressing tight as the question stabbed at his credibility. Evelyn Shaw objected instantly, her tone fierce, harassment of the witness. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "The witness will answer," he said. Mark swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. His fingers drummed nervously on the stand, betraying the storm within. The jury's faces darkened with doubt, each expression reflecting unease. Maria's eyes welled, sensing the battle of truth collapsing into confusion. Mark Ellis finally broke, his voice cracking as he said, "I don't remember everything clearly." The admission struck like a thunderclap, gasps rising from the gallery. Evelyn Shaw's smile faded, her shoulders stiffening as the case she built teetered on edge. Thomas Reed seized the moment, his tone a blade. "The jury hears it. He cannot be trusted." Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against the wood, demanding order. Maria clutched the stand as though she might collapse with the weight of it all. Daniel Hayes lifted his head, a glimmer of relief breaking through his turmoil. The jurors scribbled furiously, their faces divided, the room vibrating with doubt. The courtroom had grown restless, the tension sharp enough to slice through bone. Evelyn Shaw stepped forward, her eyes burning with calculation. She said, "Mr. Ellis, isn't it true you were in contact with the defendant outside of court?" Mark froze, his hands clutching the stand like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Daniel Hayes' eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking through his composure. Thomas Reed shot to his feet, his voice loud and desperate, objection speculative. Judge Harrison's voice thundered, overruled. The gallery leaned forward, whispering in a frenzy. Mark's lips parted, but no words came, sweat beading on his forehead. Maria Carter's nails dug into the wood, her chest heaving as if she already knew what was about to surface. Mark finally spoke, his voice cracking under the weight of silence. "Yes," he whispered, "I met with him." Gasps thundered through the gallery, the sound louder than any gavel. Daniel Hayes leaned back in his chair, his shoulders stiffening, eyes darting to the jury. Evelyn Shaw's lips curved into a victorious smirk, her eyes never leaving Daniel. Thomas Reed slammed his hand against the table. "This is outrageous." Judge Harrison's voice silenced him instantly. "Sit down, counsel." Maria's breath caught in her throat, her trembling hands pressed against the stand. Every juror scribbled furiously, their expressions shifting between shock and suspicion. The air hung heavy, the revelation cracking the foundation of the defense. Evelyn Shaw's voice cut through the air like steel. "And during that meeting, what did you discuss?" Mark swallowed hard, his gaze falling to his lap. "He told me not to testify. He offered me money to keep quiet." The gallery erupted in chaos, shouts and murmurs colliding in a storm. Daniel Hayes shot to his feet, his voice trembling with fury. "That's a lie." Judge Harrison's gavel slammed repeatedly, his booming voice demanding order. Thomas Reed grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back down, whispering furiously. Maria pressed her lips together, tears spilling despite her attempts to hold them back. The jury's faces shifted in horror, the case unraveling before their eyes. Judge Harrison's gavel echoed like thunder, yet the room still buzzed with shock. He said, "This court will have silence." His voice finally forced the gallery into uneasy quiet. Evelyn Shaw stood steady, her gaze drilling through Daniel Hayes like a knife. Thomas Reed rose, his voice sharp but cracking. "Your Honor, this is fabricated testimony with no proof." Mark raised his eyes, his voice trembling. "There are messages, texts." Gasps broke again, sharper this time, the jury jolting forward. Maria's hands shook, her knuckles white against the stand. Daniel's face drained of color, as though the floor had dropped beneath him. Evelyn Shaw turned toward the jury, her voice steady but burning with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is no longer hidden. The defendant tampered with a witness." Thomas Reed's fists clenched at his side, his face red with fury. Daniel Hayes buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling with rage or fear. No one could decipher. Maria Carter let out a choked sob, her entire frame trembling as though she were breaking apart. Judge Harrison struck the gavel one final time, the sound reverberating like a hammer sealing fate. The jury scribbled faster, the gallery whispered in disbelief, and the trial shifted into uncharted territory. The courtroom had reached a boiling point, every word now a weapon drawn and fired. Evelyn Shaw stood, her voice sharp as a blade. "The evidence proves manipulation and deceit." She pointed toward Daniel Hayes, her tone unforgiving. Daniel's head shook slowly, his lips parting as if to scream, but no words came. Thomas Reed slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "This is not justice. This is persecution." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his face carved in stone, his gavel resting in his hand like a loaded gun. Maria Carter clutched the rail of the stand, her body trembling, her tears staining the wood. The jury leaned closer, their pens scratching furiously, every stroke deciding the fate that hung by a thread. Daniel Hayes suddenly rose from his chair, his voice erupting with desperation. "They're twisting everything." His shout echoed across the chamber, shattering the brittle silence. Evelyn Shaw raised her chin, her calm composure like steel against fire. Judge Harrison slammed the gavel, the sound like thunder. "Order in the court." Thomas Reed reached for Daniel's sleeve, pulling him back down, whispering fiercely. Maria's breath hitched, her chest shaking as if every word clawed through her bones. The jury's eyes widened, some startled, some skeptical, as though the very truth were unraveling before them. The gallery's whispers swelled into a tide that could not be silenced. Evelyn Shaw strode forward, her voice unwavering. "The truth doesn't tremble, it stands. Only lies collapse under pressure." Daniel sank back into his chair, his shoulders hunched like a defeated soldier. Thomas Reed whispered urgently, his hands moving in sharp gestures, desperation clinging to every word. Maria's tears flowed freely now, her eyes locked on Daniel, as though she carried the wound of betrayal herself. Judge Harrison adjusted his robe, his glare sweeping across the room, daring anyone to break the order he demanded. The jury shifted, pens scratching frantically, their faces pale under the weight of history forming before them. Judge Harrison's voice rolled like thunder. "We will hear closing arguments." The words fell like the final bell of a prize fight. Evelyn Shaw rose, her blazer sharp against the dull tones of the courtroom, her voice fierce. "The truth has clawed its way here today, and the defendant has nowhere left to hide." Every syllable cut like a knife. Daniel Hayes lowered his head, his hands covering his face. Thomas Reed's jaw clenched tight, his pen snapping in two. The jury watched, eyes burning with intensity, some nodding faintly, as though already shaping their decision. The gallery's silence was electric, charged with the gravity of the moment. Evelyn Shaw's closing words rang across the chamber like a final strike. "Justice is not blinded here today. It sees clearly. The lies have been exposed." Her voice faded into silence, every juror staring at Daniel Hayes as if the verdict was already etched into their minds. Thomas Reed stood, his final plea broken by the cracks in his voice, but the room had already shifted away from him. Maria Carter sat trembling, her tears finally slowing, as though she had released everything she carried. Judge Harrison lifted his gavel, its weight symbolic of the fate about to fall. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, a stillness that could crush souls. The courtroom felt drained, as if the air itself had grown heavier after the storm of closing arguments. Maria Carter leaned back against the wooden stand, her eyes red from tears, her shoulders shaking. Daniel Hayes sat slumped, his hands gripping the table like anchors pulling him down. Thomas Reed whispered furiously, his voice breaking as he searched for a thread of hope. Evelyn Shaw gathered her files with calm precision, every movement sharp, controlled, certain. Judge Harrison studied the room, his eyes scanning over the jury, then back to the silent figures at their tables. The jury box was still, each member writing in silence, the sound of scratching pens filling the void. The gallery sat hushed, knowing the climax had passed, but the weight of resolution had only begun. Daniel Hayes slowly lifted his head, his lips trembling. "They don't know the truth," he muttered, the words barely audible but heavy enough to cut the silence. Thomas Reed leaned close, whispering, "You must hold yourself together." Evelyn Shaw caught the words, her expression sharpening, her posture unrelenting. Maria closed her eyes, pressing her hand against the wood, her body trembling with exhaustion. Judge Harrison exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the gavel, waiting for the jury to return. The gallery shifted restlessly, sensing that the end was near, though no one knew if justice or tragedy would triumph. The jury filed out slowly, their faces unreadable, leaving behind an echo of tension that filled every corner of the chamber. Evelyn Shaw stood tall, her hands folded, her expression fixed and controlled. Thomas Reed pressed his hands flat on the table, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the door where the jury had disappeared. Daniel Hayes sat motionless, staring downward at his own hands, his breath shallow and uneven. Maria Carter bowed her head, whispering words only she could hear. Judge Harrison adjusted his robe, his deep sigh filling the room. The gallery whispered softly, like wind through broken glass, each spectator knowing the verdict would decide more than guilt. It would decide legacies. Time stretched as the courtroom waited for the jury's return. Thomas Reed wiped his brow, his hands shaking for the first time in the trial. Daniel Hayes muttered under his breath, his words broken. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Maria Carter stared blankly ahead, as if hollowed by the weight of everything. Evelyn Shaw remained composed, though her jaw tightened as she tapped her pen against the table. Judge Harrison looked toward the bailiff, nodding once, a silent command for readiness. The gallery leaned forward, bodies rigid with anticipation, every heartbeat sensing with the suspense of the moment. The bailiff's voice broke the silence. "All rise for the jury." Chairs scraped against the marble floor, the sound harsh, jarring. The jury filed back in, each face carved in stone, their verdict held tightly in their hands. Daniel Hayes gripped the table, his knuckles white, sweat trailing down his temple. Maria Carter closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. Evelyn Shaw's gaze sharpened, unflinching, her entire being locked on the moment. Thomas Reed stood slowly, his shoulders heavy with the gravity of defeat looming over him. Judge Harrison raised his gavel, but did not strike, waiting for the words that would define everything. The jury foreman rose, his voice carrying the weight of judgment, as he read the verdict. "We find the defendant guilty." The words cracked through the silence, echoing like a bell of doom. Daniel Hayes collapsed into his chair, his body shaking with disbelief. Thomas Reed closed his eyes, his face carved with defeat. Evelyn Shaw stood taller, her jaw firm, her eyes gleaming with grim resolve. Maria Carter pressed her trembling hands to her face, her sobs muffled but unrelenting. Judge Harrison's gavel struck once, sealing the fate written in ink and blood. The gallery exploded into whispers, a storm of shock and vindication mingling in the air. Daniel Hayes lifted his head slowly, his eyes hollow, his voice breaking into the silence. "This isn't justice, this is betrayal." His words cracked with bitterness, but no one answered. Thomas Reed placed a hand on his shoulder, his own voice low. "It's over, Daniel." Evelyn Shaw kept her gaze fixed on the jury, her composure unshaken, as though already moving past the man she had defeated. Maria Carter lowered her hands, her red-rimmed eyes meeting Daniel's in a brief silent exchange, heavy with years of buried pain. Judge Harrison signaled to the bailiff, his command sharp, "Take him into custody." The clink of chains followed, final and cold. The bailiff secured the cuffs around Daniel's wrists, the metallic click louder than thunder in the silence. Daniel's head hung low, his voice gone, his body sagging as if life itself had drained from him. Maria Carter wept quietly, her hands shaking as she clung to the wood of the stand. Evelyn Shaw exhaled deeply, a quiet victory breaking through her guarded composure. Thomas Reed stared blankly ahead, his pen broken in two, forgotten in his hand. Judge Harrison's voice filled the chamber one last time, solemn and final. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and with it came the collapse of everything Daniel once was. As Daniel was led away, the gallery erupted in a storm of voices, some crying out for justice, others murmuring disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like knives carving history. Maria Carter stood, her knees trembling as if they might fail her. She whispered, "It's done," though her voice carried no relief. Evelyn Shaw gathered her files with mechanical precision, her eyes dark with the weight of battles yet to come. Thomas Reed turned his back to the gallery, his shoulders hunched, a man broken. Judge Harrison stepped down from the bench slowly, his face weary, his robe trailing behind him like a shadow. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind silence heavier than any verdict. Maria Carter lingered, staring at the empty defense table, her tears drying into cold trails on her face. Daniel Hayes' absence felt like a ghost lingering in the air. Evelyn Shaw stood by the door, her gaze fixed ahead, her shoulders squared, her victory etched but not celebrated. Thomas Reed remained seated, his broken pen on the table, his eyes lost in shadows. Judge Harrison's bench stood empty, the gavel still resting like a relic of finality. The gallery lights dimmed as the doors closed, leaving behind the echo of voices, the whisper of chains, and the lingering truth that justice was never clean.